as the seed of Abraham, to whom God promised that great consequence would follow from his calling, we're going to conclude the Alive in Messiah course by thinking about what this means for us as heirs according to the promise. And we'll be thinking about three different ways in which this can be outworked. First, when there's no constraint from our circumstances, enabling us to be in celebration. Second, when there is constraint from our circumstances, causing us to be in tribulation. And then third, when we're constraining the circumstances to produce some form of reformation. Because even though Yeshua redeemed the irrevocable calling and gifting God gave to Israel, the circumstances in which they're to be expressed are still the same. So we're looking at the opportunity within each of them to continually count ourselves as dead to sin and alive to God in Messiah Yeshua. Not just for our own personal blessing, but that we might contribute to the outworking of God's purposes in the times we're in. We're beginning with celebration, when circumstances are not a constraint, and which was vividly expressed by the first believers when initially they were together, having everything in common. And they began selling their property and possessions and sharing them with all as any had need. And day by day they continued with one mind, spending time at the temple and breaking bread from house to house. They were sharing meals with gladness and sincerity of heart, praising God and having favor with all the people. And such celebration of their newfound faith came to them fairly naturally, being an intrinsic part of their Hebraic mindset. The Hebrew word for celebrate, asah, meaning doing or making what you believe tangible in a way that has a consequence. In contrast to the Greek mindset that separated the spiritual from the physical, enabling what you believed to just be cerebral. But for the first believers, being all Jewish, tangible expression of what they believed, at least in principle, was central to their lifestyle. One example being the annual celebration of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, as they honored their calling to celebrate Asar, it as a festival to Adonai for 7 days in the year. You are to celebrate Asar, it in the 7th month, which they then did by living out in shelters made of branches for 7 days to celebrate how God had delivered them out of Egypt and sustained them through 40 years of very provisional living before bringing them to the promised land. And by celebrating Sukkot and each of the other annual feasts as well as the weekly Shabbat, Israel was reminded of how their calling to be a light to the nations was to be expressed in the whole of their lives. So they'd fulfill God's purpose statement to Abraham, saying, "My heart's desire is to make, Asar, you into a great nation, to bless you, to make, Asar, your name great, so that you may be a blessing." And which followed from his first great declaration. Let us make, Asar, men in our image, after our likeness. The consequence being that God saw everything that he made, Asar, and behold, it was very good. Which means that all of God's creation can be seen as his celebration of his being, because, as the psalmist put it, our God is in the heavens, he does, Asar, whatever pleases him. God's actions always reflecting both his character and his words, which we can presently encounter for ourselves as those he's created in his image, and has therefore made us since as a new creation, as well as by looking to the total expression of it in the life to come, when the earth will be filled with knowing the glory of God as the waters cover the sea. And the way for us to be in the flow of all this right where we are is to ensure that what we try to make tangible are the things that are good and even glorious in God's sight, which the gifts he gave to Israel that it might be a light to the nations can greatly enable. As the first believers demonstrated, not only just as an instinctive reflex, but very intentionally, in order to celebrate how Yeshua had redeemed them. Beginning with the gift of adoption, as they saw how it flowed from God's adoption of Israel as his firstborn, enabling them to receive things like success, provision, security, joy, rest, renewed strength, revelation, understanding of God's ways, and so on, which they celebrated selflessly, sharing them with one another to celebrate their new relationship with God as heirs of God and joint heirs with Messiah. And because they did so in such a tangible way, they had favor with all the people. And every day the Lord was adding to their number those being saved. Then, by drawing from the gift of glory, their celebration extended to what Paul later described as this glorious mystery regarding the Gentiles, which is Messiah in you, the hope of glory. Having experienced how when Yeshua had tabernacled on earth, they'd looked upon his glory, the glory of the one and only, from the Father, full of grace and truth, enabling them to engage with how God had first revealed his glory to Israel as to no other nation, so that they could know who he was and how he wanted to be known by them. And the hope this led to fired them up for doing God's will on earth as it is in heaven, which gave them their great sense of nearness to the coming of his kingdom on earth, and through their celebration of it, visibly expressing the prophecy of Psalm 145, which says, "All your works praise you, Adonai, and your saints bless you. They declare the glory of your kingdom and speak of your might to make known to the sons of men his mighty acts and the glory of the majesty of his kingdom. Your kingdom is a kingdom for all ages, and your dominion endures from generation to generation." The span of which led into the expectancy of what they could also draw from the gift of the covenants, having been opened up to them by Yeshua when at their final celebration together of Passover, he showed how the new covenant flowed from the covenant that God had cut with Abraham, saying, "I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings will come forth from you. Yes, I will establish my covenant between me and you, and your seed after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, in order to be your God and your seed's God after you." Because as they saw how the new covenant followed from the old and then led into the everlasting covenant, the vision of being exceedingly fruitful became real to them right there and then, through sowing the seed of celebration far and wide, particularly by seeing through the gift of Torah what the possibilities were for doing so, because though it was all the scripture they had, they'd experienced how when the risen Yeshua had met with the disciples, he'd opened their minds so that they could understand the scriptures. And what they experienced would doubtless have been like how Jeremiah had declared, "Is not my word like fire, says Adonai, or like a hammer that shatters rock?" Because it had enabled Peter to preach so powerfully from it at Pentecost and at the healing of the lame beggar, that both times it resulted in huge numbers believing, and also for Paul to be able to prove from the scriptures that Yeshua was the Messiah. And their celebration then extending on to what the gift of temple service might mean for them through how Yeshua had redeemed it, as every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. Doubtless looking back to how God's Shekinah glory had filled Solomon's temple such that the priests could not enter it, and even further back to when Moses was unable to enter into the tent of meeting because the cloud resided there and the glory of Adonai filled the temple. As well as forwards to when Ezekiel's prophecy will be fulfilled that I will set up my sanctuary among them forever. My dwelling place will be over them. I will be their God and they will be my people. Because having recognized how at his cleansing of the temple, Yeshua had said, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up. And that he was talking about the temple of his body. This then transformed what it meant for the first believers to serve in his temple through knowing that they were now in him, both there and then. And beyond this, looking ahead to what it's going to mean in his end-time kingdom. The result was that they had so much to celebrate. And this was heightened further still as they then drew from the gift of God's promises. Having seen how Yeshua had fulfilled so many of them, especially to do with his birth and his death that he had no control over, which assured them that the yet to be fulfilled promises really would be. Not least that for Israel, nations will see your righteousness and all the kings your glory. You will be called by a new name, which Adonai's mouth will bestow. You will also be a crown of beauty in the hand of Adonai and a royal diadem in the hand of your God. And all this so inspired and enabled the first believers to celebrate with great boldness that through Yeshua they were the Israel who God had called to be a light to the nations. And though their circumstances were very particular, there is a sense in which our own circumstances are also very particular, being so near to the end times and yet not being constrained by the sort of things we might be in the not too distant future. And this means that what the first believers demonstrated about the potential of the gifts that God gave to Israel and Yeshua then redeemed is for us and can greatly help us with our own asar, that it may then greatly impact others. With that, let's now think about these 3 questions. What is so distinctive about the gifts of adoption, glory, covenants, temple service, Torah, and promises? Then secondly, how can we celebrate our relationship with God in the whole of our lives? And thirdly, how can the end time visions of celebration inspire us?